Allow me to introduce our two sponsors who will be speaking during this program. Please stand and be recognized. Sherry Crasium Bolin, tax partner for, okay. She's a tax partner for RLH CPAs and Business Advisors. They have been a member of the Carroll County Chamber for 63 years. Dave Peliquin, President of Main Street Advisors and a Carroll County Chamber member for 16 years. So we have a lot of longevity here as far as membership in the Chamber, which is good. I would like to recognize at this time elected or appointed officials with us today. Commissioner Richard Rothschild. Sheriff Jim DeWeese. State's Attorney Brian DiLeonardo. And County Commissioner Dennis Frazier. Are there any other county commissioners here? No, they're not. No, okay. From the Board of Education of Carroll County, we have Board of Education President James Dolan. Is he here? No. Board Member Devin Rothschild. Is she here? No. Board Member Bob Lord. Yeah. And Board Member Virginia Harrison. Also with us today is the Superintendent of Carroll County Public Schools, Steve Guthrie. We'd also like to recognize Dr. James Ball, President of Carroll Community College. Are there any other officials that I perhaps overlooked today? None? Okay. Will the former past chairs of Chamber of Commerce Board please stand and be recognized? David Bollinger of Barnes Bollinger Insurance Services. Mike Shank of M&T Bank. Steve Aquino of Aquino Financial Group. Stephen Wantz of Carroll Community College. And immediate past chair, Lori Blake of Fuchs North America. Also, if you're a member of the current board of directors, please stand and be recognized. Today's corporate sponsors are RLH CPAs and Business Advisors and Main Street Advisors, our Advisors LLC. Our first sponsor's message will be delivered by Sherry Crasium Bolin from RLH.
Thank you. As was noted, chamber members for 63 years in the Carroll County area. Obviously, I haven't been here that long. But we are very proud to be a part of the community in Carroll County, and we want to share a few exciting things with you that's happened at the firm within Mike's very strict 5-minute timeline. You'll notice that RLH CPAs and Business Advisors doesn't sound like somebody that's been around for 63 years in Westminster in Carroll County. However, recently this past year, we have some exciting changes going on, and we were previously known as Reger, Lehman, and Houck PC. We got together with our team this summer, and we talked a little bit about that. Of course, the name Reger, Lehman, and Houck is very near and dear to us. As many of you may recall, Randy Reger, one of our founding partners, passed away in, I believe it was 2007. And so we've been struggling with keeping his name in our name for a long time, so that's why it's very familiar to us. R, of course, stands for Reger, L stands for Lehman, and H stands for Houck. So keeping those things in mind, but also realizing we sounded a little bit like an attorney's firm, maybe. I don't know how many times people asked me what law firm I was from. So we did change things up a little bit, and RLH CPAs and Business Advisors, so you know that we are CPAs and Business Advisors, keeping with our tradition here in Carroll County. As well as Carroll County, we also do have offices in Hanover, Pennsylvania, and Frederick, Maryland, and another exciting change that happened this past year was that we were able to merge another small firm into our Frederick office. So we're very happy to let you know that we've grown this past year, and we're providing tax services throughout more than just one county here in Maryland. So I'd also wanted to just quickly draw your attention to the flyer that we handed out to everybody, along with a pen and one of my business cards. We also added a new team member in our Westminster office this past year who I want to introduce. Phil Stoller is our new accounting and auditing manager. Phil has many years of experiences and hopefully will be helping out Wanda Lynn, our accounting and auditing partner in our Westminster office. So we look forward to having Phil on board this year. Also wanted to draw some attention to some services that maybe you didn't know that we offered. Along with that business advisors piece of our CPA firm, you may also think that all we do are tax returns and financial statements, but there's a lot of other things that we do provide. For small businesses, for example, we do have in-house accounting systems advisors and bookkeepers full-time. Some people come out and give you quarterly advice. Some people come out and help keep your QuickBooks accounts all straight. So we do have a full team of accounting system advisors, especially QuickBooks Pro advisors in-house, and we do payroll services as well for the small businesses in Carroll County. So look over this sheet. We did find that as we talked to our team this summer that a lot of people don't really know everything that we do. So we're putting this together for you. Maybe that gives you a quick synopsis of some things that we provide that you may not be aware of already. So thank you, and we enjoy listening to Ted every year through our Leadership Carroll program, which I'm going through this year's class. Ted grilled us really good last month on the budget, and I don't envy your job, Ted.
Thank you, Sherry, for your comments and your support of the chamber. I did omit, I want to thank the Community Media Center as they're filming today's event, and we're streaming the presentation live, so I apologize for omitting them.
Thank you, guys.
Our next sponsor's message will be given by Dave Peliquin, President of Main Street Advisors, LLC.
Good afternoon. Good to see everybody again. Always get a big full house for Ted. I think we've co-sponsored this with Rager, Lehman, and Hauk or RLH Associates and CPA not for 63 years, but for probably 7, 8, 9 years. And hopefully we continue to keep doing that because it's great to see people come out and listen to information about budgeting and numbers. Main Street Advisors, LLC is in its 17th year here in Westminster, sharing space with RLH Associates. And our job is we manage about $41 million on a discretionary basis for about 130 clients. We utilize Charles Schwab. And the difference between discretionary and brokerage services is that our investment selection, our philosophy, and our strategy is totally independent. So if you've got questions, if you like second opinions, happy to talk to you. Easy to find us on the web. I don't put the signs up and such because if somebody's looking for us, they'll find us. I thought I'd have 2 things for you to take away before we turn it over to Ted. One is to consider, I've said this now for 3 or 4 years, I think the high debt levels around the world, around the country, around the state, around the county, and in your neighborhood are what's reducing both global growth and national growth by about 1/3. It's been 8, 9 years like this, and I think the markets are recalibrating finally. I could be wrong. My advice would be for folks who are within 10 years, even 15 years retirement, make sure you talk to your advisor and don't be too aggressive, right? If it's taking you 25 years or so to get to where you are, don't let the last 10 years, I don't see a repeat of 2008, but who wants to even talk about that? So keep that in mind. The second thing is talk to your advisor or your CPA about the changes in Social Security claiming benefits that just were put through. It could have an impact on what your plans are. And pay attention. I think it's up to 13% of Americans have gone online and set up an account at ssa.org or whatever the website is, because you just Google it and it'll bring you there. I'd urge you to go on there and pay attention to your Social Security benefits because all of us are going to rely on them. You can start at 62, but you can learn how, if you can wait until you're 65, 66, 67, you've got even more benefits. And there's ways to plan that with your investment advisor or with your CPA or whomever you rely on to set up a spreadsheet and kind of look at which way is the best way for you to go. Keep in mind that I think it's something like 63% of Americans take their benefits as soon as they can at age 62, and giving up by doing that a penalty. Full retirement age for people retiring today is around 66, depends on the exact year of birth, but that's a huge discount. I mean, you're taking a good 27, 28% cut on what you'd have if you can wait. So even if you wait a year because you draw on a different account or something, you're picking up a 6-7% raise in your Social Security benefit every year. Believe me, the Social Security Administration loves that people take it early, as would anyone who gives out that kind of a benefit. So with that being said, you didn't come here to hear me talk about Social Security or investments. So I'll turn it back over to John and probably Ted. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave. We appreciate your support of the Chamber. If anyone is interested in sponsoring an upcoming Chamber event, please see Mike McMullen before leaving today, as there are a few sponsorship opportunities remaining for 2015. Now let's begin our program. I'm sure most of you know Ted Zaleski. As Carroll County's Director of Management and Budget, Ted is responsible for the budget, grants, and risk management functions. He is also a major resource to the Chamber and to the rest of the community. Ted lives in Carroll County just outside of Westminster. Today, Ted will talk about the issues involved in the county's fiscal year, budget 2016 and beyond. And then we'll take questions. Please help me welcome Ted Zaleski.
You know, it's always endlessly amazing to me that people actually come here to hear me talk. And even more amazing that people pay to come here and hear me talk. You know, you heard that a couple of my commissioners are here. It's always a pain when they show up because I have to scrap my notes and think about what I can say now. You know, I come with prepared notes every year, but in the conversations I have while we're waiting, I usually end up with enough things that I wouldn't even really need to prepare stuff. I could just talk from those. But you know, just a couple thoughts from early on. You know, I saw Steve Powell is here, works at Carroll Lutheran Village now, but he hired me at the county in 1994. Best I can recall, this is the first time he's ever actually come to this event. Now, to be fair to him, I'm thinking the explanation might be that when we worked together, he figured he heard enough from me at work and didn't need to come here to hear more from me. And you know, I was thinking about how time goes by. David's daughter, Sarah, and my daughter grew up together. And I can remember, you know, ferrying them from one house to another or to some event. And now this summer, my daughter and Sarah got together in Atlanta. I'm just thinking, wow, how things have changed. And I think Mike is trying to play with my mind. I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, we moved from the room over there to this room.
We've always been here.
Yeah. I remember I walked up to the door, and it's locked, and it's dark inside. I said, what happened? Did they cancel this? Or what? And I come here today, and there's signs out front, say this way for Norwegian something, and this way for some physical therapy. And I had a moment of panic. Oh, no, they must have moved it somewhere else. All right, so on to what we came to talk about. You know, and I always struggle with what to talk about because there's so much, and I don't have enough time to really talk about stuff. So you try and figure, okay, what can I talk about that is going to be interesting and useful and isn't just the same thing as last year? But so I'm thinking about this and say, okay, we've been doing this for 14 years. And we've had this talk through some good years and some bad years, downturns and recoveries. In the last couple of years, you've heard me say, we're recovering, but we're not recovering like we have from other downtimes. The details differed, but, we went down and then there was a bounce back up again and things felt normal. And what I've been saying is we're not bouncing back like that. And I'm looking again today with what information we have, and I'm saying I still don't see us bouncing back. And this isn't a prediction. I want to draw a distinction between predictions and projections. What I do is look at what information we have available, try and determine what reasonable assumptions we can make about the information that we have, and say, where would that seem to take us? A prediction is me saying, here's where I think we're going to be. What I'm saying to you is, based on the information I have, this is what it seems to imply to me. Could be next year that everything's going to change. Jobs are exploding, wages are going up, the housing market is booming, and it's going to be a completely different message. But as things stand, with the information that I have available to me, I have no means of making an argument like that. That's not what I see. And as I'm thinking about this, I said, there's one thing that really feels different to me now that's a change from where we've been all these other years. And that's that things are so tight, so balanced. You feel like you're sitting right there on top of this little peak, and you could tip this way or you could tip that way. Not that I feel in danger of tipping back, but you can't look and say, okay, there is no danger, that we've moved beyond it. I spend a lot of time, me and the people who work in the budget office, talking in much greater depth about things that we didn't talk so much about last year, because things that used to be relatively unimportant, which is not to say unimportant, but in the big scheme of things, it just wasn't the place where you're going to spend your time. They've become more important because smaller things can affect that tipping balance. We probably spent a half an hour a few days ago talking about our projections for income tax growth out several years. And we were going back and forth between 4.5% or 4.75%. It's not that big a deal, but it's a big enough deal that it makes a difference now because things are so close. So I'm going to talk about three big ideas today. A little bit about the county budget, not as much detail as maybe I've gone into some other years, but give you some sense of where we are. I want to talk about the state budget and implications for us here in Carroll County. And then I want to talk about the school system, their budget, school closings, and related issues. On the county budget, you've heard from me before, the people who have been here, property tax and income tax is about 60% of all of our revenue. So what's happening there is what really matters. Property tax, last year, I told you, 6 years out, when we look at the possibilities for reassessment and how much growth we were seeing, 6 years out, we were going to get to what I thought would be about 3% growth in our property tax revenue, our largest revenue. The last reassessment, it's down in South Carroll, where we are actually seeing, at least in parts of South Carroll, increasing prices and some increasing activity. We were looking for a 10% reassessment. Now remember, we went through that unprecedented 5 years of declining assessments. This is our second year up. But we thought we saw enough there to build in an assumption of 10%. What we got was a 6% reassessment, so that was somewhat disappointing. I kind of feel like the state might be a little bit conservative, but they do the assessments, we just deal with the impact of the assessments. But we had to rethink then, what does this mean for our future projections? And that 3% 6 years from now, 6 years from now, what I'm going to be suggesting is about 2.5% growth in our property tax revenue. Again, our largest revenue, 6 years from now, growing 2.5%. So when I talk about long, slow recovery, that's a big part of it. And it's hard to see what is going to change that in any significant way. Income tax in the current environment is kind of a good news story. We are seeing growth there. The last couple years, we've seen pretty consistent growth. But even there, historically, if we looked at income tax, growth of 6% would have been a reasonable thing to talk about. Not that it was necessarily going to be 6%. One year it'd be 4, and the next year it'd be 8, and then 5 and 7. But if you kind of drew a line through it, that would be a reasonable expectation. You heard me saying we were kind of working our way through 4.5% or 4.75%. We're not back to what we would think of as normal. The other revenues after that start to get smaller. Not going to spend a lot of time on those today. But there's a little bit of good news here, a little bit of bad news there, but nothing that really changes the picture that I was just laying out for you. On the service side, for years now, go all the way back to fiscal year 9, we've seen little growth in the county budget, which means little growth to all the various agencies, whether they're departments that report to the commissioners or the nonprofit service providers or the school system or the community college. They haven't been seeing much growth either. One of the few places where we can point and say, well, look, that grew, not that it's been spectacular growth, but noticeable in the current environment at least, would be public safety, the sheriff and the state's attorney, volunteer emergency services. The little bit of room there's been, that's where most of the choices have gone in recent years. But all those agencies that aren't seeing much growth are still struggling to provide the level of services that people have come to expect from them. And it is a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's getting harder and harder as time goes by. Now, recently, the commissioners have added back a handful of Carroll County government jobs. Some years ago, we eliminated about 12% of the workforce, about 100 employees. They've added back a few of them, but we're still far, far from the staffing that we used to have. But there's been no diminished expectation for what the people who are left are going to do. Talk some about the governor's budget now. Our relationship with the state has changed significantly over the last couple of decades. The state is not a significant funder of Carroll County government anymore. Now, they are a significant funder of the school system and the community college and others, but very little money comes to the commissioners from the state. Give you a little rundown of some of the agencies that are impacted. The school system looks like it's going to be down about $1 million from the state, which is bad news, but relatively good news. They were expecting to be down about $2 million, so they fared a little bit better than they were looking for. The community college, in today's environment, is seeing a fairly good increase from the state, small increase for the library system. The health department, again, in this environment, is getting what is an unusually good increase from the state this year. Program open space, which we use to fund our park programs along with our impact fees, is less than it was last year, but more than we were expecting. So kind of like the school system, it wasn't as bad as we thought it might be. But this is an ongoing problem. The state, for years now, has been diverting more and more of the state transfer tax, the portion that was supposed to be going to local jurisdictions. More and more of it is being pulled aside for state purposes, leaving less behind for us to take care of our park needs. And highway user revenue. This is a really interesting one. Some years ago, we got about $12 million. This is a state-shared revenue for maintaining our transportation systems. In recent years, we've been getting about $1 million a year. The governor has declared his intent to restore local jurisdictions to the funding that we had in the past, over 8 years. And his budget did include the first step toward doing that. But he did an interesting thing. The formula is in state legislation, but the extra money that the governor has added in his budget, he is not looking for change to legislation. He's included it in his budget as a grant. Now, you might say, well, if you're going to get another $1 million, whether it's in the formula or it's in a grant, you're still getting another $1 million, right? And that's true. The problem is, if it's in legislation, if you want to reduce it, you have to go through the legislative process to get to that ability to reduce the funding. If it's a grant, it can be simply a matter of, the governor looking at the budget and saying, you know what, I'm having trouble making this work. That funding we put in that grant, maybe we're going to reduce that by half, or maybe we're just going to get rid of it again entirely. It will be hard. If it continues this way, it will be hard to get comfortable that this is money that we're going to be able to count on and plan on every year into the future. We'll have to think about this money differently. The governor is proposing a change in income tax for people 65 years old and older. He's looking for a 4-year phase-in, and this will need legislation, a 4-year phase-in to a $5,000 personal exemption for people, for seniors. Now, if you're in that category, of course, this sounds like a good idea, less income tax. For the county, in terms of looking at revenue available for providing services, this is potentially a problem for us. Now, it's hard to quantify this exactly at this point, but we're thinking that at full implementation, this could cost the county about $3 million a year. This comes back to that there's just not much room on that tipping point idea. When you look at our operating plan, 6 years where we've looked at our revenues into the future, our expenditures into the future, made sure that they balance, the revenues can cover the expenditures, $3 million a year off the bottom line is enough to immediately make 5 years unbalanced and the last year of the plan just barely balanced. That $3 million is enough to change everything that we're thinking about right now. Governor is also talking about expenditure mandates, reducing expenditure mandates. And what he's talking about here is laws that require him to do certain things in the budget. Maryland is fairly unusual in that the governor has more power and control over the budget than in most states. You could argue, in some ways, a response to that unusual arrangement, the legislature has passed a lot of laws that say, well, since we can't change your budget, we're going to put in law what you have to budget. The governor is saying, I want to reduce some of those mandated expenditures. We need more flexibility. We need more room when things are tough to be able to make choices. Now, on the surface, that sounds perfectly reasonable. This is another one of those things, though, from the county point of view, we have to say, well, what might that mean to us? And this becomes important because many of those mandated expenditures are for funding that comes to agencies in Carroll County. We're talking about legislation on how the school system is funded, how the community college is funded, how the library is funded, the health department, program open space for the counties and the towns, highway user revenue for the counties and the towns. So that idea of reducing mandated expenditures almost certainly, if it happens, will translate very directly into changes in how much funding is available in Carroll County for providing the services in those agencies. Those of you who have come in previous years almost undoubtedly have heard my little rant about what the state calls aid to local governments. And if you just need a quick reminder, it's not what it sounds like. Included in that category are schools, community colleges, libraries, health departments, counties, and towns. 85% of what the state calls aid to local government goes to Carroll County Public Schools. Less than 10% of it comes to counties and towns. So when they're talking about aid to local government, for the most part, they're not talking about money that commissioners and mayors and town councils get to use. They're overwhelmingly talking about money that they are providing to agencies that exist in state law, and part of their role is to fund those agencies. So all that said, if you look, how has that relationship changed over time? And this is a really good example of how the period you choose to look at can be very important. I saw a state document that talked about the change in the funding that was coming to counties and towns. So not the whole pot, but just the counties and towns. From fiscal year 12 to fiscal year 17 is up 67%. You hear that and you'd say, wow, that's really good. And I bet there are people in this room who will hear from state representatives who will say something like this, like, what are you complaining about? You know, funding is up 67% in the last 5 years. What more do you want? But let's take a look at it a little different way. Let's go back to fiscal year 7 instead of fiscal year 12, keeping fiscal year 17 as the end point of our comparison. Remember that 67% increase in funding? From fiscal year 7 to fiscal year 17, what elected officials in counties and towns are getting from the state has declined by 33%. A very stark contrast in how to look at this. And to my way of thinking, the longer view there is the more relevant view. I mean, that's what we're really dealing with. 10 years ago, we had this to work with. Today, we have this to work with. Now, talk some about schools. And I'm going here particularly because it's been getting a lot of attention in recent months. And I have to say, Superintendent Steve Guthrie has got to be the unluckiest superintendent who ever lived. He got the job. We've had a recession the likes of which none of us have ever experienced, a lack of a recovery different than anything we've ever experienced, declining enrollment in the school system different than anybody's ever experienced. It's hard to imagine that anybody could luck into all those things at the same time. But first I want to talk about capacity. In our school system, we have room for about 31,000 students. Now that's high school, middle school, elementary school, all across the county. So one seat isn't necessarily, you can't swap it for another seat. But in the biggest picture, we have 31,000 seats. At the height of our enrollment, we got up around 29,000 students. Now, 31,000, 29,000 seems like a reasonable place to be. Today, we're closer to 25,000 seats. 25,000 students. And with the school system's current projections, they would have us going to 22,000 students. And I have no reason to argue that that is an unreasonable projection of where we're going. There's nothing that indicates that number is going to be climbing anytime in the near future. So 31,000, 29,000, then you think about 31,000, 22,000. That's a lot of empty seats. And that just by itself, forget any other conversation, that's enough to raise a question, does it make sense to have 31,000 seats for 22,000 kids? But that's not the only question out there. The school system is facing big fiscal difficulties. Give you a little bit about why that is. Now first, state funding. State funding is driven in part by enrollment. Enrollment is falling, state funding is falling. And when I say falling, we're not talking about a smaller increase than they got the previous year. We're talking about fewer dollars than they had in the previous year. Another piece of the state funding is a wealth calculation. And it's a per pupil calculation. So if everything else stays exactly the same and you have fewer pupils, you do the math and you now appear to be wealthier according to this calculation. Doesn't mean you have another dollar to spend. But according to the calculation, you're now wealthier than these other counties, and that drives funding down as well. So as the school system has been losing enrollment and state funding, they've lost something like $11.5 million of state funding. So again, $11.5 million less than they once had. So, we've got this declining funding, but that's not the whole picture. You also have to think that in other times, it's not just that they weren't losing money, they were also gaining money from the state. So you've got this loss of revenue, but then you also need to think about what would we have been getting in another time and start thinking about just how much money we're talking about that that the school system might have expected from the state in other circumstances. Then they also get funding from the county. Now, the county funding has not fallen like the state funding has, but it hasn't grown a lot either. In fiscal year 10, and remember, the county has been dealing with the effects of this recession as well. And this is not just about the school system. Going back to the other things I'm saying, this goes through everything we have to deal with these days. But on the county, on the school system specifically, in fiscal year 10, the county funded the direct funding that they get to use to operate their system, $167.7 million. In fiscal year 16, this year, county funding is $169.5 million. So it hasn't dropped, but it hasn't increased a lot. So for the school system, they're looking at this capacity, they're looking at a loss of state funding, they're looking at relatively small increases in school funding, and they're left to try and figure out how do we deal with this. Now, that idea that doesn't make sense to have 31,000 seats for 22,000 kids by itself was a good question, but when you're struggling to figure out how to balance the budget, it becomes a very, very important question. Now, I don't want to get into any arguments about what schools should be closed or not. I understand it's a very personal argument for every person who is tied to any school. But in the end, for me at least, it's hard to argue that the school system did not need to make this choice to close schools. Then one last piece about the school funding. Something that's caught attention is the governor included in his budget a one-time $4 million to help the school system with this idea of declining enrollment and loss of funding. And not only was it not clear that it was going to be an ongoing funding, in the governor's budget, there's actually a very explicit statement that says, and these weren't the words, but this is one-time funding, don't expect it next year. And then there's been this idea that either the school system or the commissioners turned down this $4 million of funding. That never happened. Nobody ever said, no, we don't want that funding. But what we had to do, well, I say we in a very broad way, I mean, this is a school board decision, had to say, okay, well, if we're going to get $4 million one time, what do we do with that? How does that change our situation? And the answer is it doesn't change the situation. You can't give salary increases with $4 million of one-time money. You can't hire teachers with one-time money. You can't expand gifted and talented or special education programs with one-time money. You still need to pay the bills next year. Now, there are plenty of things the school system could do with $4 million of one-time money, but it didn't change their situation. They were left with exactly the same problem. So again, putting aside what anybody thinks about what school funding should be or what should happen with schools or not, I just thought it was important that people understand that as appreciative as the commissioners and the school system were for the offer of that funding, it didn't change their situation. Now, as we wrap up, Mike McMullen thinks of me as a little bit too serious, buttoned down kind of guy. So I just want to show everybody, I can take off my tie. Some people think I mow the lawn in a suit. And I'll even unbutton my shirt.
All right.
And then go a little bit further though. Mike also likes to say, he likes to see my wild and crazy side, and he wants me to wear an AC/DC t-shirt. So I've got a surprise for Mike today.
It's the highlight of my day.
All right. Now I button down again. Okay, so that's everything I came to say today, but I'd be glad to talk about whatever you all would like to talk about now. Is there going to be someone with a microphone?
Yeah, questions. We probably don't have a microphone out in the audience.
Okay, I'll repeat the questions.
You must have questions.
I have a question. You mentioned about the dramatic drop in the school enrollment, and I'm just wondering, is it because people are moving out of the county, or is it because couples are too busy watching football games to maintain it?
I was actually watching something on TV about Super Bowl babies. Apparently, there's this, the city where the Super Bowl is held has this boom of babies 9 months later. It's an interesting question. I can't say I have the answer, but first, population growth in Carroll County is not very big right now. We're not growing very much. One thing we can look at, though, is our birth rates are down significantly, where we once were maybe getting 18, 19, 2,000 births a year. We're more like 1,400 or 1,500 births a year. So they're not entering, we don't have the new kids to enter kindergarten. I don't believe we have any strong evidence of big out-migration. It's just we're not bringing in kids or having kids.
Our population's aging. Our population is aging, so birth rates are down commensurately.
I've heard several different statistics about what portion of Carroll County's budget is allocated to the Board of Ed. And there's been a lot of talk about the fact that it's obviously you said the money went from 132 to 167 or whatever, but in terms of the portion of Carroll County's budget, what has it been the last several of years and what is it now?
Okay, and I said I'd repeat the questions. I didn't on the first one. She was asking about the share of the county budget that goes to school system, a number that's been coming up a lot lately. And I think this has been somewhat misunderstood and maybe not fully thought through. But there's an idea out there that we historically had funded the school system with a little bit more than half of the county's budget, and that now we're lower, and that was a change in philosophy. Now, we could argue about the philosophy part, but the numbers part doesn't work out quite the way that is. I actually went back to 1990, and from 90 until fiscal year 16, the average share of the county budget that goes to the school system is 47.2%. Now, we are a little bit lower than that right now, so it's true that we are lower. But there are other things that you would need to consider. And first I'll ask a conceptual question. How small would the school system have to be before you would say it doesn't make any sense to still get 50% of the budget? Now, not that this is going to happen, but if our school system was 5,000 students, I don't think anybody would argue that it would make sense to still be 50. So a starting point that it used to be this and now is this, I struggle with a little bit. But in a more specific way, a lot of things have changed. And if we go back to the 90s, there are a lot of things that are in our budget now, many without us having made a choice to do it, that are part of the bottom line and take up money and means something else is going to get less. And I'm not saying that there's been any specific connection between the school system and the other things, but we can't divorce the school system from how we get the whole budget balance. And just give you some sense of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. We now pay a share of the state teacher pension. For us, that's $6.7 million a year that we didn't pay in the 90s, but do pay today. MDE and EPA have mandated huge efforts on our part toward stormwater remediation that takes up a part of the budget that wasn't part of the picture back in the 90s. In the 90s, we had a tiny little bit of funding for paid EMS personnel. We provide a significant amount of funding for paid EMS personnel. Now, this next one you could say is a choice, but I'm not sure it's a choice that too many people will agree with. The commissioners directed a significant increase in funding to the state's attorney and to the sheriff in connection with concerns about drugs in Carroll County. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole list of those things, but if you start looking at you didn't have to pay it here, now you have to pay it, it's part of your budget, things are going to have to change. It sounds like a simple idea, but it's, I would argue, much more complicated than it's been presented. Somebody else had their hand in it.
Hi, I'm Barbara Ringhurst, BB&T Mortgage. And dovetail on the first gentleman's remarks, I've raised 3 children in Carroll County, moved here, transplant from Baltimore County in 1985. All 3 of my children went to North Carroll, so they're not unhappy, they're not very happy about North Carroll. What they did, they became very independent as their mother taught them, but they found that they could not afford to buy their first home in Carroll County. All 3 of my children then chose to go to York County, Pennsylvania, to Baltimore County, and my son is now going to Baltimore City to buy homes. So I think one of the things I'm seeing as a parent, as somebody in the community, someone doing mortgage, we have a real problem with some sort of housing to capture these people so that they can be helping to pay some of the taxes that we need the revenue for what you're talking about. And that is why, gentleman number 1, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, that we're having issues with the younger generation. And that's why Carroll County, in my opinion, seems to getting older as opposed to attracting a younger community.
And for those who couldn't hear all that, the main point was Carroll County can be a difficult place for young people to buy a first home or a second home. Any other questions? David?
One area that would give you the most optimism. Repeat the question.
David wanted to know what's one thing that I have the most optimism about. Yeah, there's not a lot that I can look at with optimism to say, here's something that's going to happen to us. But I will say I remain optimistic that we will continue to do what we need to do to make things work. You know, we will react to the environment that we have, and we'll figure out what we do with that. And, you know, sometimes people will accuse me of being pessimistic, and I always argue with that. You know, I believe I am optimistic because I always believe we will figure it out. That's different, though, than thinking property tax is going to go up 20% next year because I'm optimistic.
Well, Ted, on that, some people will say in conversation, okay, so if we bumped up the property tax rate, however you get to that, some significant amount, then we could fix it. Just give us an idea of everyone's property tax. Instead of paying $3,000, they pay $3,300 next year. And I know that you've got a good grasp of the budget. How much does that, everybody goes up 10% on the property tax, how does that help?
Yeah, David was asking, you know, what would be the impact of a property tax increase? And for casual talking purposes, you could say every penny on your property tax rate is about $2 million of annual revenue to the county. So depending on what you want to fix and how far you want to go, you know, if you wanted $10 million of ongoing money, we're talking about a 5-cent change to your property tax rate. Currently at 1.018, so that would put us up over 106, or however far you'd be looking to go. Anybody else? Well, thank you then for amazing me and coming again.
Nice job, thank you. Appreciate that. Well, I'm optimistic that after, this is my 6th year doing this, and I've been with Ted in Leadership Carroll in here, and I've been asking him if he'd wear an AC/DC shirt every time. I'm optimistic that things can change if you keep asking. So for those out there that I've been asking things of, I'm going to keep asking, okay? That's all I'm going to say. But I would like to thank you all for being here today. This was really good. We always pack it in. Peggy's flashing a flyer. I do have it on my list. I will mention it. I also would like to thank Ted. Give him a round of applause. Guy does a good job. And our sponsors. Okay, hang on a second. I always want to say Rager, Lehman & Hauk. RLH CPAs and Business Advisors and Main Street Advisors. Thank you, guys. And we do have a few more events for this year. If you would like to sponsor, come and see me. We can definitely fit you in. There's a flyer in front of you, somewhere probably buried underneath your plate, and it's to sponsor a school bus or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 for our Drug and Violence Awareness Expo. This will be our second one. The last one we did last year was great. This one will be even better. And it's on April 28th, and we really do need some help so we can get the kids out to this. So please, you can see Peggy about that. Peggy, everybody knows her, you saw her on the way in. Thank you to Mr. John Yingling. Ben's dad did a great job. Ben might be replaced. Ben would not like that. And to the community media folks, thank you so much for being here with us today and, you know, for helping us out, filming this so people can watch at home. We're beginning to at this point, take applications for Leadership Carroll class of 2017. So it will fill up. When I mentioned this at one of our last events, we had 3 people. We'll go ahead and apply. It's on our website right now. You can go there. You can talk to me. It's a great event. If you have never been, let's say if you know absolutely nothing about it, ask somebody. How many folks by show of hands have been through Leadership Carroll in this room? So ask any of those folks. They'll tell you it's great. So at least I would hope they'll tell you that it's great. Last but not least, I believe, we're going back to Cuba. So this will be our 3rd trip. We went before going there was cool. We went in 2014, and we brought 40 folks. Last year, we brought 54, many of which are in this room. This year, we've got like an actual, I think we've only got maybe 40 tickets to go with. So the trip's going to be November 11th through the 20th. We've got flyers out there. And we're doing an info meeting tonight. If you're interested, right back here in this exact room at 6:30 tonight. So just come on by, and we'll give you like a drink or two and a little bit of food, and we'll talk about Cuba. So other than that, I don't think there's any other announcements that I've missed. No? Thank you so much again for being here, and the meeting's adjourned. Thanks.